Genesis 2. So, just like Genesis 1, we're going to be returning back to Genesis 2. Now, this is 6 months. 6 months since I wrote it, a few months since I last read it, and a lot has changed. So, we're going to be going through this again. Now, while technically Genesis 2 includes that last section, this first paragraph here, I decided to categorize it under Genesis 1 because it's really part of the Genesis 1 story, not the Genesis 2, 3 story. So, it's just a bit of a weird formatting thing. But if we look back to how it was originally written, it was more of a scroll, right? It wasn't really separated, so the separations are perfect. I'm just not sure why they didn't separate it to be nicer. It's not like Genesis 1, it was extremely long. Look at Genesis 24, much longer than Genesis 1 by just about a factor of 2. So, not sure why it was formatted that way, but that aside. This is the account of the heavens and the earth, when they were created, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Now, no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So, in Genesis 1, that was already a full, finished account of the creation of the earth, right? And the creation of humanity. So, why is it being told to us again, it seems? I hope there's no contradictions here. Now, first of all, the general, let's say, religious way of interpreting this, if we're not going to say these are two different stories, and they don't care about continuity. These are not the same story. They're two different stories. They contradict each other because they're two different stories. But if we're not going to just accept that fact, what is the way we can, handle this story existing when we already have a story? Generally, the story is placed on the 6th day. The 6th day being where, God makes humans, man and woman, right, together in Genesis 1, right? But the problem with doing that is saying this is the 6th day is, well, the order's kind of weird, right? Things don't seem to match. So, it hasn't rained anywhere on the entire Earth yet, even though we have the sky around for 2 days, right? We've had the sun. Sorry, sky's been around for 4 days. So first of all, this is now, right, like I said, the 6th day. It's the creation of, man. Humans are going to show up now, right? So this must be the 6th day in the framework where we're trying to fit the stories into each other. And it hasn't rained on the entire Earth yet, even though the sky's been around for 4 days. It's a bit improbable, but sure, that's kind of minor, a bit of contrivance. Now, the streams do line up with the idea that the Earth just kind of began as orb or plane of waters. That's good, at least, in terms of continuity. However, no plants yet on the 6th day? Those things have already been around for 3 days, supposedly, so why have they not sprung up? Right? As for the man from dust theory, of course, evolution disproves that. But let's just say I'm going to presume it's true for the purposes of this chapter here. But, that's not real. I'm not going to just throw away the whole formation of man thing. It's very important. I'm not done with it. We see here, right, God is forming, he's sculpting a man from the dust of the ground, presumably, by hand, right? And then he breathes life into it when it is done. Now, the idea of sculpting a man, the gods sculpting a man, is actually an incredibly common archetype in myth for pretty simple reasons. Now, myth develops from what people know, right? That's why we see so many flood narratives, because people live near rivers. What do rivers do? They flood. And floods are very important, but they're also very destructive, so they end up in mythology. There's a bunch of archetypes that show up in mythology and stories across region, across period. But one of those is that archetype of creation from clay, right? Like I said, myth is developed from what people know. Clay, or some equivalent of clay, is present basically everywhere. People have been sculpting figures out of it for, I think 30,000 years off the top of my head. So, at the very least. So it's hardly a stretch for any of them to go and say, yeah, God would do the same, or gods would do the same, because what are gods? They're just basically humans, kind of pumped up humans, super powered humans. They share many human qualities, and so they also share human behavior in many ways, as I talked about last chapter. So this idea of sculpting is just a natural conclusion, right? And there's a Wikipedia article I have linked here, right? And I'll just open that up, actually. So if we look over here, there's a lot. I don't think this covers everything, but here's just a lot of the very big ones that are, prevalent. Okay. Now, like I said, this is something present, reflected across the world. And that also includes, of course, many cultures near by the Israelites, like the Greeks, Prometheus. Naturally, of course, the Sumerians and Babylonians, the general people in that Sumerian bubble, are also going to have these myths because they're going to take them. But I actually kind of want to focus on the Egyptians here. Now, this is from that same Wikipedia article. And there's two things I have highlighted here. Firstly, the Egyptian god Kum is said to create human children from clay before placing them in their mother's womb. It's a creation from clay archetype, right? Very common. But there's also the second one I've highlighted, and this is the god Ptah was said to have created the world, including humans, from an act of speech. Now, that latter one, what does that sound familiar to? That's Genesis 1. Because what does God do in Genesis 1? He incants things into existence. He speaks them into existence. Sometimes it says, God says, I will do X, and then X happens. But many times just as God says X, and then X was so. Right? So he does incant things into existence. Right? He says things, and they are just so. And it could be when he says things and then he does things, that's more of a poetic difference. Right? But he seems to be speaking things into existence in Genesis 1. Not Genesis 2. He doesn't do that. Though he does have a curse, but that's, I think, a bit different. Well, that's technically Genesis 3, but that's aside. Now, Ptah originates from the Egyptian city of Memphis. And the Memphis's patron deity, basically their god, who they said was the big cheese, the very important god, was, you guess it, it's going to be Ptah, right? That's why Ptah makes the world in their mythologies, because they worship Ptah the most. Now, if we actually look at a map, I think this, can I know? Here. Memphis is here, right? And if you notice, Memphis is very close to Canaan. This is where the Israelites would have been. This is a very short jump for, some sort of osmosis of cultural ideas to travel. We know that there was travel, there was trade, that's beyond any shadow of doubt. Intermingling of cultures just kind of happens, especially when they're that close. And so they doubtlessly took ideas, and so this inspiration seems more than just a little coincidental. Anyways, now, like I said, Ptah in his creation with Genesis is matching Ptah's creation with his ancient Egyptian story, and the creation of Genesis is very, very similar, right? And that's actually quite different from the creation now, in Genesis 2. That creation difference is now, it's a sculpting, it's a creation from material, from dirt, rather than just he speaks and it is so. Now, it's not necessarily a contradiction, but it is a vast difference in presentation. Now, continuing, This is from, oh, I didn't link this one. That's sad. I think it's from this Britannica article, though. But I will link that later. Egyptian creation stories say that Ptah made the other gods by first imagining them in his heart and then using his voice to breathe life into them. He went on to produce other creatures from metal, stone, and wood. He also brought forth towns, religious shrines, and established ceremonies of worship. But notice the breathing life. Now, where did we see breathing life? The Lord God formed a man from dust. He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, right? And he speaks things into existence. This seems like a lot of coincidences, right? Now, the oldest record we actually have of this this story from Ptah is the Memphite theology, which has been dated to about 7,000 BCE. But we do have very strong evidence that this was just a later copy, and their earlier source was destroyed. This is reading off of sacredtexts.com. It is dated 700 BC and bears the name of an Egyptian pharaoh who stated that he had copied the inscription of his ancestors. Clearly, it's older. The statement is verified by language and typical arrangement of the text, and therefore assigns the original date of the Memphite theology to a very early period of Egyptian history, i.e., the time when the first dynasties had made their new capital at Memphis, the city of the god Ptah, i.e., between 4000 and 3500 BCE. Intellectual Adventures of Man by Frankfurt, page 55. But what does this tell us? Again, the stories of the Israelites in their Bible are likely borrowed from the cultures surrounding them and predating them. Now, this is one of several Egyptian stories that I mentioned, specifically the one from Memphis. And I actually did post the map, and specifically not the Memphis from Tennessee. And like I mentioned, cultural osmosis certainly happened. But since we're on the topic of Egypt anyways, let's talk about a place called Elephantine. Now, it's going to be a bit in the future, about 3,500 years from the Memphite theology, about 600 to 400 BCE. This was actually mainly while Egypt was ruled by a Persian satrap, basically a regional government from the Cyrus the Great's Persian Empire. Now, what is Elephantine other than something in Egypt, though? It's a small island on the Nile. It's around here-ish, off the top of my head, around there. And if you notice, that's where the Nile actually gets really wide. It's where the first place that happens. And it's set up right over here on the island. There was a fort on it. It was called Yeb, the fort. And it was basically to protect the river before it got really wide. Right? So it's a strategically important place. Now, this is actually going to be quoting, I'm going to be quoting, mainly for this section, a few PDFs of very old reports from the University of Chicago. And when I say really old, I don't mean like 50 years. These reports are both from World War I, or in the midst of World War I. One's from 1915, one's from 1917. Now, partially, that's because information on this subject, many esoteric subjects, very niche subjects, is very inconvenient to get, and most of it is very much privatized. And so, what you're looking through is very inconvenient to read, very not nicely formatted, very old, many times outdated texts, but there's still a lot you can glean from these. And actually, interestingly for me, reading these PDFs, I didn't just get information about Elephantine, I also got a lot about the cultural norms and the ideas of the people who wrote these papers 100 plus years ago. Now, I do think it is a genuinely good read to get a general gist, this PDF here, of what was going on at Elephantine. A lot of it is talking about religion, but it talks about a lot of other things there. It's only about 40-some pages. It's not a crazy read, not like a light one either. And in its second half, it talks actually about the syncretism between the Egyptians and the Greeks actually also seem to have derived their god from their neighbors across the Aegean. Right? This process of borrowing and adapting gods is not unique to the Romans, it's not unique to the Israelites, it's not unique to anyone. Every single culture that came after our previous culture, asterisk there, but just about every single one, took ideas, and many of those ideas were religious ideas, from those who came before. I've actually heard thoughts that Yahweh and Zeus both actually originate from the same root Sumerian god, but I haven't actually gotten a chance to look into that yet, so take that with a grain of salt. Now, anyways, this Jewish garrison held the island at this time, and you might be wondering why the hell are there Jews on a random island in Egypt? Is this evidence for the Exodus? Did they just not leave? No, and we'll get to that later. But these soldiers, and the settlers along with them, naturally had a temple. Most people would build a temple when they would go somewhere where there isn't one. And this temple was called the House of Yahweh, and it will be referred to in these PDFs as the House of Yahu. But they are one and the same, Yahweh and Yahu. And it was built somewhere around 600 BCE among already existing traditional temples to the elephantine triad, which are just the pre-existing Egyptian deities of the area. Interesting, that name, that temple name, House of Yahweh, actually shows up in the Bible as well. It seems fairly common, right? So that may be just a type of temple rather than the specific name of this one, but it's referred. That's how it doesn't really matter for this. I'll just be referring to it as temple or House of Yahweh. But to read the quote now, how there's a lot of things how we know they were a military force, but I mean there's a lot of clear letters. And quoting now, leaving all discussion for the present, we pass to S6. S6 is one of the documents recovered from Elephantine. An exceedingly interesting papyrus clearly dated in the 5th year of Darius. Darius was a Persian emperor, not the empire. It is addressed to Jedoniah and his colleagues, the Jewish army, the ones who held the fort. Another very cool things about the Elephantine, all the text we have from Elephantine is all dated, or refers to figures we know about when they were from previously dated texts, which makes it really, really useful as a resource. Now, interestingly, this House of Yahweh, despite its name, seemed to not only worship Yahweh, but also some other deities. S19 of the 5th year, presumably of Darius, is one of the sensations of the collection. It is a great list of the names of the Jewish army that gave money to Yahu, the god, each man 2 shekels. Jedoniah P. Jamaria is treasurer. The list is dated the 3rd of Thamenoth, the 7th Egyptian month, and the offerings are doubtless for the temple. The names include 36 women, but the list is incomplete, and we miss several well-known names. Besides, although the list enumerates 115, i.e. 230 shekels, the total sum is given as 31 keresh. 1 keresh is 10 shekels, and 8 shekels, i.e. 318 shekels. Of this sum, it is said, and this is very important, for Yahu, Yahweh, 12 keresh, 6 shekels, so 126 shekels. For Asam Bethel, 7 keresh, so 70 shekels, about half, a bit more. And for Anath Bethel, 12 keresh in silver, so nearly as much as Yahweh, right? Just 6 shekels less. Yahu stands at the head, and on the only natural interpretation, he has associated with him here these 2 subordinate deities, otherwise unknown, but whose names are composed of familiar elements. Now notice this is otherwise unknown. Remember, this is an ancient, literally ancient, I guess, bit ambiguous since we're talking about actual ancient history, but this is 100 years old. We have more information than the writer does. And I actually mentioned it right here later. We know who these goddesses are, or we have a decent idea at the very least. Now, you might have noticed that the term Bethel shows here at the end of these goddesses' name. Bethel is going to show up a decent amount. It just means house of God. In modern Hebrew, it's just spelled Beit El, Beit El, just literally house of God El, general term for God, not El the God, because the term came from, of course, El the God. Anath Bethel is hypothesized to refer to the ancient goddess Anat, who shared a close relationship with the god Baal, an ancient Canaanite storm and fertility god we mentioned very quickly earlier in Genesis 1. To give you an idea of what I mean by this, when I say relationship, she defeats Mot, death, for him, albeit temporarily, in the Baal cycle, which is a ancient Ugaritic a text, or technically it was on tablets, so I guess that's still a text, isn't it? Now, here's the cool thing. The Baal cycle discovery date, is from 1928. Notice this is more than a decade after this document was written, this one that I'm reading off of right now. So, oh, there's my mic. So that's something that's important to know with these documents. They are out of date, right? But they still do have useful information. What was I? Right. Now, Anat is generally regarded as either a sister or lover to Baal, but at the moment there's not necessarily a conclusive answer on that front. It's also possible that different groups also worship them with different relationships. I can't cross that out. And, as mentioned, just as El merged with Yahweh, so did Baal. And this is from Wikipedia on Baal. The Deuteronomist and the present form of Jeremiah seem to phrase the struggle as monolatry, or monotheism, against polytheism. Yahweh is frequently identified in Hebrew scriptures with El Elyon. However, this was after a conflation with El in process of religious syncretism. El, Hebrew, El, became a generic term meaning God, as we could see from Beit El, as opposed to the name of a worshipped deity, and epithets such as El Shaddai came to be applied to Yahweh alone, while Baal's nature as a storm and weather god became assimilated into Yahweh's own identification with the storm. In the next stage, the Yahwistic religion separated itself from its Canaanite heritage, first by rejecting Baal worship in the 9th century, then through the 8th to 6th centuries with proper prophetic condemnation of Baal, sun worship, worship on the high places, practices pertaining to the dead, and other matters. Now, they share many qualities, and obviously they are both storm gods, but note how God also continuously tells his creations, be fruitful, increase in number, be fruitful and multiply. This phrase constantly shows up, and I want you to pay attention to it, because it shows up a lot. Now, it's not even just their qualities here. I still seem to have forgotten to mention, Baal was a storm god, right, like I said, but he was a storm god of fertility. And actually, in that Baal cycle, which I just mentioned, before Anat defeats Mot, Baal actually goes in hiding. And while he's in hiding, his storms are not feeding the land, and so the land is not fertile. So he's a god not just of storms, and he's a god of fertility. And storms are a symbol of that fertility. Whereas Yahweh's storms are more violent, unless fertile, generally. But this idea of fertility is focused on as well here. Now, it's not just these qualities that they share, but also certain texts match, and which can be seen with Psalm 29, right? This Wikipedia page goes in detail about what is happening with Psalm 29. I'll go into detail when we get to Psalm 29, if I somehow keep doing this that long, right? As well as Yahweh's destruction of Leviathan when juxtaposed to Baal's destruction of Lotan. And just for a fun little way just to see how similar these are, if you look at the Wikipedia pages, they use the same damn image. Now, there's one other example I want to talk about here, and we're going to have to introduce another player for that, and that being Ashera. Ashera was the consort of El, but she's also actually the consort of Baal in some regions, where she was given the title of Balat. She was also placed by the side of Yahweh as his consort later on, which we can, see in inscriptions like those found at, I'm going to butcher this, Kuntilet Archut, I think. As for Azim, Bethel, also referenced across scholarship as Agam, Asam, Asham, Bethel, Yahu, or Yaho, which is very fun to research. See, she seems to represent the elephantine Ashima, a goddess of fate. Regardless of who these goddesses are and how they kind of seem to connect from Yahweh to Baal, these Jews seem to show a pretty big penchant to polytheism. And this goes even further with an acceptance of the Egyptian gods they lived amongst. Following this trail, we next discover that the Aswan Jews did not, and Aswan is the general region where Elephantine is, did not hesitate to take oath by deities other than Yahweh. Miftahia, a Jewess, as her name shows, in a suit with an Egyptian, takes oath in court by the Egyptian goddess Satis, F. Another Jew, Menahem Bar Shalom, in a suit over a donkey, swears by Mesgid and by Anath Yahu. That's Anat, right? These cases, however, do not carry as far, since foreigners and foreign courts are involved, and such oaths were probably obligatory. More significant is the fact that the occurrence of personal names compounded with divine names other than Yahoo. Now, this is the second PDF I was talking about, also from the University of Chicago. And it's also a great read, notably shorter at 12 pages. It's more focused on the topic at hand, and goes into more detail than I do in terms of Elephantine. However, like I've mentioned, it's really old. And with a lot of literature from the time, it's very pro-Bible, right? This modern scholarship of the Bible has only been really a thing for half a century. Bible minimalism, treating it as mythology. A lot of old archaeology, ancient's a weird term right now, is very biased. They're looking for things. They're trying to prove things. Look at what happened on the island of Crete and how Crete was disrespected. Because what the archaeologists, and that word is used a bit, let's say, liberally here, did is when they unearthed murals from Crete, they were uncolored. And he painted over the murals to make them nicer, which obviously is a big no-go in the modern era. The ancient archaeology is very biased and doesn't really follow with what we had now. And like I'm going back to this is very pro-Bible. And you don't see it for the vast majority of the document, but the interesting thing is the final pages rely heavily on biblical verses and really ends with a congratulations to the prophets on, and this is a quote, changing tenses slightly and shortening it, lifting their countrymen from crass polytheism to ethical monotheism. Right? And like I mentioned kind of at the beginning, I'd recommend looking into this, not from just the sole perspective of understanding ancient Judaism, but also understanding ancient anthropology and archaeology and how this was done back in the day. And as mentioned, many polytheistic cultures commonly borrowed from their peers in a syncretic manner. The Romans, obviously. But what this shows us is that far from the strong monotheism of modern Abrahamic religions, or even the monolatry that we get following this period, these Jews probably fell into a more henotheistic view, if not even an outright polytheistic one. Now, you might be wondering about the source of the Jewish presence here, right? Well, rather than leftovers from the Exodus, as I mentioned earlier, which probably didn't really happen to begin with, they're thought to be refugees from the siege of Jerusalem. This is by the kingdom of Neo-Babylon. If you guys remember the Babylonian exile, Neo-Babylon, well, obviously, is the one who, did that. And before they began the exile, they had to fight the Israelites. They besieged Jerusalem. And so it's hypothesized that these Jewish settlers, these Jewish soldiers here in Elephantine, fled that conflict and came to Egypt. And it's actually even been termed by some scholars as a reverse exodus, ironically. Now, as for the idea that, hey, this might just be some secluded group of refugees completely disconnected from mainline Jewish tradition, society, well, I quote, the papyri themselves bear witness to the extent of intercourse. The fragments of the Behistun inscriptions of Darius would indicate that copies were sent around, or at least that they were so evidently interested enough to desire a copy. The so-called Passover Papyrus, the correspondence between Elephantine and the priests of Jerusalem, the governor of Judah and Sanballat, are evidence of interrelations which, to judge from the various biblical references to Egypt, were not confined to any one age. Moreover, the jar handles from Phoenicia indicate communications between Upper Egypt and the Levant. Consequently, we are not entitled to regard the Jewish colony as some secluded parochial community, living a sequestered life, retaining such religious conceptions as the early founders had brought with them, and untouched by, if not ignorant of, events in the world outside. But how do we know all these, though? As you guys have probably guessed, and how I've probably hinted to very explicitly, Elephantine is a treasure trove of documents containing records on everything from marital disputes, letters, most importantly for us, temple records. Additionally, these documents are often dated exactly, or barring that, like I mentioned, include references to the same people referenced in dated documents. So we can actually track certain families through these documents and how they generational. Even more importantly, these mostly private documents, due to their circumstances, managed to escape the redactionary arm of the priestly sources. These documents are known rather creatively as the Elephantine, Papyri, and Ostraka. I was actually going to make a joke about the name being self-explanatory, but then I realized I didn't know what the hell Ostraka was, because exoteric terms are fun. Ostraka are just pottery fragments with writing on them, because that needs a word. Now, the priestly sources, if you guys don't know, are basically the it's known as the final redactionary layer over the Tanakh, basically, or the Torah. These priests who went back and changed things, tried to make it more cohesive, and tried to make it all work, right? They're probably why we see something like, why is Yahweh showing up before Yahweh is supposed to show up? That sort of stuff is probably a result of faulty redaction and cleanup. But why is that important, these documents? Why is it important that they escaped the redactionary layers? Well, we've talked about how the Israelites were polytheists prior to Yahweh, and how they shifted towards monolatry even after his introduction. Other than the important and fascinating example of what this middle ground between monolatry and polytheism looks like, why do I bring this up? Well, remember the dates when this temple was operating? Roughly 600 to 400 BCE. And do you remember when the Hebrew Bible was being written? About 1200 to 100 BC. And what about the Torah? The 6th to 5th centuries BCE, e.g., the 500s to 400s. Hardly even a simple overlap, they're practically a direct match. This gives us a massive insight into what the culture at the time the Torah was written thought about Yahweh, thought about other gods. This is an incredible backdrop, an untouched set of documents that tell us what life would have been really like from a theological perspective. And while they may not perfectly reflect the attitudes of mainstream Judaism at the time, as discussed, this was hardly an isolated group. They had communications with Jerusalem itself, right? The use of Yahweh's name had not reached a point of sacredness, at least for them, to the point of being censored, something characteristic of the later 3rd century BCE he was one god here among many, or I guess in the temple among a few, albeit the most important one. These ideas would have been floating around in the environment the Torah was written in. This helps explain the biblical mismatch of ideas on God, and as will be continually pointed out, the evidence of a patch job trying to make it work together. And now with all that out of the way, we will return to our regularly scheduled Bibling. Anyone have any thoughts, ideas, questions, whatever else might pique your interest? I'll take that as a no.
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
I guess so. I feel like this might be naive. I don't know, but I feel like if like during the merging process of these gods,
Mm-hmm.
it would be some sort of record of people who like disagree with it, right? Or like I don't know, like or do these things happen like language where it's so gradual that people don't really notice there's a change?
I mean, it definitely depends, right? But
Yeah.
I don't know if we necessarily have public complaints in like written form as we do for like later stuff, because it's not like writing was something very common or really accessible. I do remember hearing something about um polls. 1 second. Schism. But I haven't looked into this yet. But I've heard of, I mean, actually, no, we do have a lot of stuff. I just completely forgot about it. The Bible itself actually discusses this very thing you talked about. There's a lot of mentions of idolatry, right? Even in uh, Exodus, when Moses is going down Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments, what does he see? He sees the golden calf. Who was the
Right.
golden calf a symbol of? The old gods. Which god? El's symbol. El was a bull. His symbol was a bull, and so it was doubtlessly referring to El. We also have mention of Asherah poles in the Bible. Remember, we talked about Asherah, the consort, right? And these were also causes of certain, not concerns, but disagreements, arguments, issues. And here we can see against Deuteronomy, right? It says God hates Asherim. Poles, don't set up poles, put them next to altars, don't plant trees, Asher, that sort of stuff. So we actually have, interesting, like I just didn't think about that, a lot of records of people who did not like the old way. As for people who did not like the new way, I don't know if I've seen it yet. I've heard something about different idols to Yahweh and Baal being placed in each other's temples. I just haven't gone to look into that. Let me see if I can find it. Uh, Ancient Israel, uh, divine icons, Baal, Yahweh placed in temples. Let's see if I can find it. Uh, yeah, I don't know. I don't think this would. I mean, here's just showing how old Baal is, 3,200 years old, right? 1200 BCE, right? Even older than that. Oh, yeah. I'm not signing up. Okay. Uh, yeah. I don't know of anyone off the top of my head when it comes down to it of basically disagreements with the new stuff. Keep in mind, change is generally like religious change. In many ways, is affected from, especially in this time period, the written records would have been from the wealthy and the ones who could afford to have scribes write things down. I don't know, like I said, I don't know if we'd have written complaints except in law codes. So it makes sense that with Deuteronomy is a book of rules, and for the most part. And so rules against the old ways make sense to find. But I guess complaints against the new ways, since the new ways went out, those would be hard to survive if they really existed in a written form. I heard a great quote at one point, but I can't remember the exact wordage. but it just is basically history is constructed from what was written, right? Something like that. We can't. We only know what evidence gives us to know. Evidence lets us know. And there's not just written records; those are a very big deal. We also have archaeology. We have settlements. We also can do things like find large quantities of feces or crazy thing like camel domestication Middle East when let's see if I can show it up. And I don't like a full PDF. I remember I think this is the one. But there's the really cool thing with oh my god, National Geographic. Do I have to this is 1 second. I think was it Science Daily? No. I forget what it was. Or was it whatever. May have been this one. But 1 second. Okay. No, go away. Whatever. But I remember. Oh wait. I found it. Cool. I don't know if this was the exact article I read, but this is what I was looking for. This is slightly off topic, but whatever. Two archaeologists at Tel Aviv University, the anachronisms were motivation, and they're talking about some basically probably the mismatch of actual historical reality with what's in the Bible. There's a bit of a controversy with there's a lot of camels with Abraham, and there really shouldn't be camels there because they weren't domesticated yet. I don't know. I haven't really picked a side on this yet because I don't see strong evidence either way. Honestly, it seems controversial, so I haven't written on it yet. But cool thing in this one site, they were able to realize when camels were showing up in this one site, this melting area. And what they did is they basically noticed the difference in the bones of these camels between the different layers and noticed that at this layer, suddenly all the camel's bones show characteristic signs of wear that you would see from carrying heavy loads consistently, and all the camels before that point didn't have that. So there's a lot of really cool things that are employed to reconstruct history, right? So it's not just text, but texts are very, very useful, though you have to take most texts with a grain of salt, right? Until you can find corroborating evidence or corroborate textual or otherwise, right? But I hope that answers the question, although I don't know if it fully does, because I don't know about any anti-Yahweh that recordings that survive. But I'll try to look into it.
Yeah, I'll try to look into it myself. But yeah, that was pretty helpful. Thank you.
Okay, cool. No worries. Anyone else have any questions before we continue to actually get into Genesis? I'll take that as a no. All right, cool. All right, let me just get some water. This was a lot of talking. Now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. The Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So just about everyone I have ever spoken to agrees that the Garden of Eden is just basically an allegory for heaven, or may just literally be heaven itself. But that's not how it's described here. I mean, the east is very much a specific direction, and that only applies to Earth. What's east of Earth? Right? That's a nonsense question. And you can't go east until you end up in heaven, because if you go east far enough, as we'll see in Genesis 4, you end up in Nod, away from God, where God cannot sense you at all. You don't have contradictions with that, right? Clearly, going off the Bible, going east does not take you to God or take you to heaven. So I don't think east is a poetic term meaning towards God or towards heaven. So if that east is an allegory, it really muddles the water with that description. Now, when I originally was researching this way back in the day, I tried looking into where the Israelite tribes were during the Babylonian exile, and they were in modern day Iraq, because that's where Babylon was. And Israel was to the west of Iraq, right? So in Jerusalem as well, and also the Cave of the Patriarchs, which is hypothesized by some to be the entrance to the Garden of Eden, although I don't know if that was prevalent at the time. I haven't gotten to look into it yet, sadly. But in all likelihood, this came from some old oral tradition of some sort, this East thing, so I'm not necessarily too sure one way or another. I've also heard that the garden was planted in an eastern section of a specific land called Eden, and that just kind of shares similar issues. We don't really know if Eden's to the east or it's in the east in Eden, right? Because that could mean it's to the east and then the east of Eden, right? Which is, I think, a book, right? But I would say probably more to the east, and then it was also in Eden, which was all bundled together to the east. Now, continuing. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there, it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first is Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east side of Asher, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. Now, Tigris and Euphrates, you guys know those. Those are real rivers. Those are their modern names. Now, this is not what was originally written here. You can see that in certain translations. We're going to see the Pishon, the Gihon, and these are actually the Parat and Hiddekel rivers, which we can actually go, if we go to Hebrew, we can see that here. Where are the rivers? I might be blind. 1 second. Right. Oh, it actually is saying Tigris here. Whatever. Hiddekel, right? And that is the Tigris. And Euphrates is over here, Parat. Right? So it's the Hiddekel and Parat rivers. That's their original names in Hebrew. And then the names changed over time. And we have records that we can link these together as to what rivers these are supposed to be. Now, the other rivers, there's Bible activity. Cut down my tabs. The other rivers here are left in their original Hebrew names, just literally transliterated into English, because we don't really know where those rivers are supposed to be. There's a lot of hypotheses, but we don't have an exact, it's definitely referring to this river. Now, further muddying the waters of Eden, right, in its location, is, whether it is on Earth or not, is this very specific description of the various rivers that source from Eden's river. And the geography of all the lands as well around these rivers. If this was written to be an allegory or a metaphor, the amount of detail it goes into on background information is fundamentally meaningless to the story itself. Really, it would just be a mistake as allegories go. Now, I could have sworn I had a map of these rivers. Oh, here they are. Let me just... I guess I'll get to there later. Okay, my bad. I forgot how I structured this. But let's say I were to steal one of Aesop's fables. And I'm not even going to read the original. I'm going to read what I did to it. I added a section to this fable. Let me know if you can tell me where that section is. Right? Now, the meaning of this fable is incredibly clear, and there's a little explanation on the bottom explaining the meaning. But even without it, it's very obvious what this story is meaning to impart. It's short, it's clear, it's to the point, but I'm going to add a section to the story, and I will read it out loud to you guys. I'd like you to tell me what I changed. It might be very, very difficult for you to figure it out, right? It might be nearly impossible, right? But let's try it. The mice once called a meeting to decide on a plan to free themselves of their enemy, the cat. At least, they wished to find some way of knowing when she was coming, so they might have time to run away. They wished to run to their holes in the walls. The walls were constructed with plaster, now no longer produced, but it had been imported by a French company. This company shut down shortly before the story due to an economic downturn. The plaster had been placed onto a plywood support fabricated specifically for this house, and there was no asbestos, but there was the beginnings of a mold problem. In another section of the house, there was a large group of spiders who did not live in the walls, and in the shed there lived a rather obtuse gopher. Indeed, something had to be done, for they lived in such constant fear of her claws that they hardly dared stir from their dens by night or day. Many plans were discussed, but none of them was thought good enough. At last, a very young mouse got up and said, "I have a plan that seems very simple, but I know it will be successful. All we have to do is hang a bell around the cat's neck. When we hear the bell ringing, we will know immediately that our enemy is coming." My bad, hit my mic. All the mice were much surprised that they had not thought of such a plan before. But in the midst of the rejoicing over their good fortune, an old mouse arose and said, "I will say that the plan of the young mouse is very good, but let me ask one question. Who will bell the cat?" Of this section, of this thing here, which section do you think I added? Either just verbalize it or pop on the dock and highlight it. What do you think is the section that I put there?
Second paragraph.
Second paragraph. Anyone disagree with second paragraph?
I do not.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it should be obvious. If you guys did not get second paragraph, I would have been kind of concerned. Because what role does the second paragraph serve to the story? None.
Absolutely nothing.
Does the second paragraph harm the story, help the story, or do nothing?
I do nothing.
But it takes up space. It distracts from the meaning of the story, because this is not like some grand fictional story. This is not something that needs background information. This is a very simple fable explaining about how saying something and doing something are two very different things, right? That's the point of the story. This is wasting space in the story. This is not helpful to the story, and insofar as that, it ruins the attention, it's dull, it's hurtful, because it obscures the purpose of the story. This shouldn't be here. This is bad. Like, for example, imagine you're watching a movie. Movies are edited down to be shorter, because pacing is important. Pacing is part of the quality of a movie. Imagine they never, cut down the movie. Let's say there was not a single, bad scene in the movie. Not a single scene that didn't hurt the movie, that didn't do a character assassination, but it was a useless scene. Does that scene help the movie, hurt the movie, or do nothing? It hurts the movie.
Yes.
Right? It hurts. It hurts. It only hurts, because if you're trying to tell a story, unnecessary details are not good for doing that. And if we're going to say Adam and Eve are not supposed to be literal, it's supposed to be a metaphor. It's supposed to be an allegory for what happened in heaven. It didn't happen on earth. Then what is this section here? Just like my section. No one cares about the plaster. The plaster never shows up again. The gophers never make an appearance. The gophers do nothing. This section does not foreshadow anything. It tells us nothing for the purpose of the story. It does give us background information. Now, where do you want background information? You want background information in a history textbook. If you care about what happened, you care about where it happened. Right? If the point of the story is not to be a story, but to just be a fact, a history, then suddenly the geography makes a whole lot more sense. Is that section I added not parallel to the section I have, the section we have, not that I added, describing the geography around the garden? If the story is not meant to be literal, and that section is not meant to give the location of the garden, why does it exist? This heavily implies that the creation story is meant to be taken literally, and of course that's how it was read for millennia. Even to this day, people refuse to accept human evolution. Right? I don't think the majority of people do, but people do. I've talked to them. Regardless of how this helps sink the idea that Eden was meant to be taken metaphorically, my first thought was something along the lines of, oh shit, do we know where Eden or the garden are meant to be? And as I mentioned, the Tigris and Euphrates originally the Hiddekel and Parat, but scholars are sure that these are magic names for these two rivers, and the Gihon and Pishon are currently not set. We have a lot of ideas as to where they might be, but they're not known yet. Now, here's something I do want to point out, right? Sorry, with Eden being to the east. Map of ancient Near East. Here are here's ancient Israel, right? There's Jerusalem. If we go direct east, look at that. So maybe that's why Eden is to the east, because Eden is where these rivers start from, right? It's not a metaphorical east, it is literally to the east. But why is Babylon not mentioned on a map of the ancient Near East? One second, let me grab it. Babylon. There it is. There's Babylon, right there. And if you notice, Babylon's between these two rivers. Now, from Babylon perspective, it would be weird to have it to the east, right? Because it's kind of right there already. But if we go and do mark that, ancient Israelite perspective, then east does make sense, given these rivers. Now, the other two rivers, notice that if we go back to Tigris and Euphrates, go back to that nice simple map I had there are these two big rivers, right? The other rivers that are hypothesized for Gihon and the Pishon are, not matching that area. Like, the Gihon is thought to be, matched with Ethiopia, which is because Cush, as a biblical term, is matching there. And the Ethiopians identify Gihon as a river, the Blue Nile, which does encircle the former kingdom of Goham, I don't know how to pronounce that, I'm sorry. And so these other thought of locations for these rivers, and then we have just the normal Nile here. We've also been Araxes. None of these rivers, though, are part of the Tigris-Euphrates river system. These are the two rivers. These two rivers do end at the same point. They reach the sea, but they start from different points, if you notice that. Right? So this idea of it started from these rivers doesn't really work. All these postulations are in the wrong region. Even these two rivers don't start from the same source. They immediately end at the same source. Meaning, if we go off the modern river locations, this section was likely fabricated, attempting to ground the story in reality, yet accepted because no one knew where the rivers began at the time. Or maybe some people knew, but those telling and hearing the stories did not. Now, one could try to argue that the impossibility of the claim that all rivers all began at the same source somehow vindicates the unnecessary detail and means that the story was never meant to be taken literally. However, quite frankly, a claim being wrong does not change the fact that it's presented as a claim, and regardless of that, it still hurts the story if it's just meant to be a fable, as demonstrated before. Oh, here's another fun little section. Highlighted in that little section of Hebrew, we have the word. Let me zoom in on there. Oh, that's a bit too much zoom. Can I zoom? Cool. Yotza. Yotze. Yotze is actually just a normal modern Hebrew word, and it just means basically go out of, right? and as we can see from went out of. But the interesting thing about yotse is it's in the present tense. The past tense of the word is actually yatsa. And that's very curious because, hey, that's saying the rivers, at least when this was written or when this was being told, the rivers are still there. It's in the present tense. However, what makes it even more interesting, the whole section with the rivers is in the present tense, and then Genesis 2, right, is not, as a whole, just the river section. Which is very, very interesting. Now, before I do continue with this, the Bible's very weird with its tenses, lingual drift, and all. So I may just be chasing a shadow here, but the fact that this is written in present tense heavily implies that these rivers and their lands are still around, right? Or at least were still around when this was written. Again, seems innocuous, but remember that this is creation, which happened first, of course, meaning that the global flood is meant to happen later. Now, I am no geologist, but I'm willing to bet that would have somewhat eviscerated river systems and would have vastly changed the geography. Now, this could be considered a bit of a contradiction, but admittedly it's a bit weak, especially because I have no idea how a global flood would really affect the land. I just think it would probably do something, right? But again, I'm no geologist. The Lord God took the man. Actually, questions, because that was a long section. What thoughts?
No.
Okay. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And the Lord God commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." Now, if you consider lying to be a sin, then God has sinned here, and even arguably twice. I'll explain these lies in detail when we reach the point where the statements contradict reality. The Lord, when I say reality, I mean the reality of the story, not, of course, our reality. The Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." God would have known this from the start and made a perfect helper from the beginning, since, as we see here, waiting for a helper, being alone, is not good for Adam, since God's all loving, right? He would have no reason to withhold a helper from Adam, so why not just start him with a helper? Also, note helper, right? It's a bit of an interesting term. Now, the Lord God had formed out of the ground all the wild animals and all the birds in the sky. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them. And whenever the man called each living creature, that was its name. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds in the sky, and all the wild animals. Now, many people point out that the God making the animals now contradicts Genesis 1, which claims the people were made last. But the classic apologist reply, which can even be seen in the translation to try to hide this issue, is that it says God had formed, implying that the animals already existed. But if we actually look at this Hebrew, its English translation is more accurate. It just says, "Out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field." There's no had. He just makes them. It's in the past tense, but remember, this is a story of things that have already happened, right? Because it's as a story of this is how things were made. This is creation. Creation was in the past, so it's going to be in the past tense, right? So this whole section's in the past tense with him doing things, and so it's just in consecutive order. He is saying, "I will make a helper," and then he makes all the animals. It's not he says he will make a helper and then just checks all the animals, right? This is dishonest translation. Or maybe it's not necessarily dishonest, but very much biased or influenced translation. If we look at the Hebrew itself, the word used is yehitzar, which means "and he created." Now, if the animals, sorry, not the animals, if the author, the animals were saying things that were weird, if the author had wanted to say that the animals had already been made, well, there's a word for that, kfar. It means already. That word isn't used. I could easily rewrite this as, and there's my kfars for green, v'yitzar, kvar, Yahweh, Elohim. He has already done it. He already made them. He made them already. The Lord Yahweh had already created. And the English translation on this website, right, which is a direct Hebrew translation, seems to agree with me. This is specifically the 1917 JPS, for those who skipped parts of the preface. Shame on you. And also lacks that had. Fundamentally, though, as I mentioned, the Bible is weird with its tenses, so it's not certain one way or another, or isn't. Back in verse 18, God says he will make a helper, like I mentioned, for man, as a very important part of the story. But how do I know that he was trying to find a helper amongst the animals? Maybe these are just two different events. He says he's going to make a helper, then just looks at the animals and then has Adam name them, right? He's not looking for a helper among the animals, is he? But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. So clearly, when Adam's looking through the animals, this is also an attempt to find him a helper. Otherwise, it wouldn't be relevant that no helper was found, right? If I go to, like, a restaurant, and then people ask me, hey, how was it at the restaurant? And I say, I didn't brush my teeth. It would be like, what? How is that, like, before going to the restaurant? No, at the restaurant. Why would I be brushing my teeth at a restaurant? It's a weird thing to do. But I guess teeth, somewhat food-related. Let's say I didn't file my taxes. That's a very not restaurant thing to be doing, right? And so it's weird to say. This implies that having Adam name the animals was also looking for a helper among the animals. Now, this is actually the last part of verse 20, but for some reason the Bible Gateway put it on the next paragraph, so I screenshot it separately. But that's how I know that he was looking for an animal as a helper. Now, if the animals are helper candidates, and God said he would make a helper after Adam popped into existence, then logically God must have made the animals after as potential helpers. Therefore, this is just a contradiction. Anyways, there's a lot of animals. More than 99% of all species that have ever lived on Earth, amounting to over 5 billion species, are estimated to have died out. It is estimated that there are currently around 8.7 million species of eukaryote globally, and possibly many times more if microorganisms like bacteria are included. Since this is during creation, nothing would be extinct, meaning, well, this is just absurd. And before I keep going, let's discuss extinction as a concept. What sort of God would make things only for them to just kind of die? Like, why? Let's see. If his creation is perfect, if his design is perfect, as most people would argue that it is, why would he make all these animals and then just kill them? Right? Either through just natural selection, which is really quite a barbaric process, especially from an all-loving God, right? The extinction doesn't really make sense given creation, which is why extinction as a concept was so earth-shattering when it came about. Why was extinction being discovered so important? Let's see. This is just talking about extinction now. I don't care about modern species. Whatever. Anyways. But extinction was a very big bombshell. Because, like, yeah, the animals we see now are not all of them. There were more, right? There's a whole path of them. And it doesn't really make sense given, a creation narrative. And where was I? There are about 2 million known living species right now. Half are insects, and 35,000 of those, 350,000 of those, sorry, are beetles. Now, doing some math and assuming that the beetle ratio remained the same for all time, which probably didn't since life started in the ocean, we'd end up with 875 million beetles lined up for Adam to name. And the mental image of that is amazing. When I was writing this, I remember just laughing, just my ass off. Just this queue of beetles circling the globe. I actually did the math on that. They nearly did hit the perimeter of the globe, assuming each beetle was an inch long. With just some naked dude at the end, just bored out of his mind. Even if it is just 350,000 beetles, Adam probably just went insane with the beetles alone. Genuinely surprised he didn't try to off himself via forbidden fruit before he finished naming all the animals. Do I need to explain how nonsensical this is? Now, of course, the obvious question is, how do we explain evolution, extinction, things I mentioned, right? When we have this claim of all the animals made together, named together. Well, either you put this story in the category of metaphor or allegory or story, or, alternatively, you just deny scientific fact. Now continuing. But for Adam, no suitable helper was found. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs, and then closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. As a helper, mind you. So it turns out that somehow, none of the beetles were marriage material, which God already knew, but decided to have Adam go through all the animals anyways, I don't know, for shits and giggles? Not to presume God's intentions, but there's no reason for this other than, I just want to make this guy stare at beetles for 1,000 years. So God puts Adam into a coma and steals his ribs to make a woman. This is arbitrary and unnecessary. God could have just popped her into existence. And coming back to this, right, this part I wrote more recently. I mean, many of the anthropology stuff is more recent, like elephantine and such, which I think the writing quality is actually noticeably different, interestingly. But when I came back to this about a month ago, I actually found a good explanation, because it bothered me for so long. Like, why is it a rib of all things? Right? Why a rib? I heard various ideas like, oh yeah, the rib is actually a reference to the fact that human beings don't have a penile bone, like most primates do, and that was really the rib, because women don't have a penis, like that sort of thing. I wasn't like happy with that explanation, because it didn't really seem like, let's say, sufficient. But I found a much more sound explanation, sound source for this. Now, in the Sumerian creation myth, the god Enki is harmed after a series of very repetitive encounters, highly sexual in nature. And here, to heal him, and hear what we're about to see, the goddess Ninhursagha creates various gods from his wounded parts. It kind of just keeps going repeated. She goes, my brother, what part of it hurts you? What part of you hurts you? And he goes, my throat. And then Z is the name of his throat. Throat hurts me, right? And then she makes Nazi. Notice the letters match with the last letters to what hurts him. Eventually, this keeps going. She keeps making gods and goddesses out of his body parts. She eventually goes, my brother, what part of you hurts you? And he goes, my ribs, T, hurt me. She gave birth to Nin, T, out of it. But who is Ninti, this goddess made from Enki's rib? Could be a coincidence, right? Ninti's name can be translated as mistress who keeps alive, or mistress of life. A variant form of her name might be Nintihal, mistress who allocates life. However, that part was irrelevant. The meaning of her name, right, these three meanings, are all very similar to Eve's. And much less, of course, her origin story, which is exactly the same, bar different gods make the different god doing the creation, and not a god, but just a male person rather than a male god being the source of the rib. But jumping to 320, right? Adam named his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all the living, right? So what does the name Eve mean, right? We can... No, not Veed. I don't want Norse. Okay, I can cut one second. Right? Living, life. To, giver of life, mother of life. It's the same meaning. Taken from Ninti, the story taken from Ninti, remember these are Sumerian stories, very, very close, right? Just another thing that comes from the Sumerians. Now, that almost certainly is why Eve is Eve, and why Eve comes from the rib. And this actually also contradicts Genesis 1 again, as that chapter heavily implies that God makes mankind together, right? Male and female. Not male and then however long it takes him to look at the animals. Many, many years, necessarily 5 billion. 5 billion. Then lifetimes later, female. The man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." Now Adam seems to be relieved to be waking up to something like him, right? Something other than another damn beetle. However, I'm curious as to what this would mean for the gene pool, as presumably Adam and Eve share DNA, seeing as she is, well, practically a clone of him. If they have identical DNA, well, people will just not really work, because that amount of gene information just kind of does not end well, right? That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh, as in like sex, like flesh into flesh. This is a very weird way to say that, and did the concept of sex not exist before Eve? Did Adam wake up after God stole his rib wondering why he suddenly had a set of hairy balls hanging next to his pea stick? If he already had said balls, why? It's not like he could really use them in any way God approved of, right? It's a weird situation. I'm almost surprised, right, that the original sin was the fruit, not Adam just figuring out his body prior to Eve. Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. Now, when did they get married? Did Eve have a say in it? The age gap here is probably a bit problematic, seeing as this is basically a newborn marrying a man who would have spent several literal lifetimes going through all of the animals. It's just a very, very weird situation. Something I want to mention that I didn't write is notice all of this naming that happened in this chapter, just like in Genesis 1. Genesis 1, God named things, but here, Adam is naming things. He's giving things names, the animals, the word for woman. This trend of these characters giving things names is something that is very common. And this naming of places and things is something that's only going to keep continuing, mostly into places, into placemaking, as it's called. But at least here, it's not God using language which he has no reason to use, but rather people doing so, which is something people would do. But it's interesting how God has Adam name the animals, not just Adam just started naming them, right? Where was it? Right. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them. That was God's intention. It's just have Adam now name things. Why is naming so important to God? As, God, it's a weird thing for him to be interested in, I think. But that is Genesis 2. So, my mic does not want to stay on the table. Let's, we're wrapping up. So anyone have any final thoughts or questions, ideas, what have you?
I love how bad this book is.
Well, I mean, yeah, it is in many ways. But it's incredibly fascinating, right? As the fact that we are rereading this with all this anthropology, it's really cool to see where these things came from, how they developed. It's truly fascinating. And
Yeah.
the people of the time were not like more stupid than we are now, right? Something I hope is not communicate that I think they were. I don't think they were. They just had a lot less information, right? Imagine the first time you tried to do something. Well, was it very good? No. But what is religion? It's the initial way people try to explain the world. They had no training in logic, right? They had a lot of human psychology that was screwing him up. Humans are terribly irrational creatures. Rationality is very hard to maintain, even if when you're actively trying to do it. At least it is for me. And humans are also cursed with a lot of pattern recognition that tries to find patterns, that tries to go off what is known, which will give incorrect results. So yeah, the book is terrible. The book has so many issues with it, and doesn't have a place in the modern day, except as, well, I guess, a curiosity. In the same place where ancient Greek myth sits now is where these myths should sit. Very important historically and anthropologically, but nothing to base your life on. That's my view, anyways.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I sort of have a question for you. Like, how do
Hmm?
you? I was always I always thought it was really funny that God told them like that the tree was referred to as the tree of knowledge of good and evil,
Yeah.
because it sounds like in the tree of life as well. Like those sound like only positive things,
Hmm.
and it
Yeah.
seems like God would be basically request or like commanding us to not. The way I interpret that now, and I could be totally off, but is like don't develop a system of ethics that's without me. Like don't
Yeah.
come to your own knowledge of good and evil. It has to come through me. And if you try that, you know, bad news for you.
Well, I mean, it's very common with the characteristic of God. If you ever heard God is jealous, he is. God does not want you with other gods because he's a jealous God. That's what he says himself, or is said, is attributed to him. Of course, I don't think he said anything, right? But not congenially. What's the word? Whatever. There's a word with a C. Whatever. Um, but no, this God is not. It's not. He's not good. He's not loving. He's not selfless. He's a bit of a narcissist. He makes people for like worship, right? In Christian circles, he makes the devil and then doesn't defeat the devil so that he can just because the devil making things bad allows him to then fight the devil and show how cool he is. We look at Egypt. He's the one who delivers the Jews to Egypt. He is the one who has the Pharaoh keep them there. Why? So he can show how cool he is. So he can show how big his fucking divine dick is. That's what Egypt was. That's what the children of Egypt was. That was what the suffering of his people was to him. An excuse, a manufactured situation to show how cool he is. When it comes to Abraham and not the killing of Isaac, but the near killing of Isaac, the knife was about to go in. What does he say at the end? What does his angel say on behalf of him? Fear. That is what God is happy with. He's happy that Abraham feared God more than he loved his son, his only son. God is not loving. He's a monster. He's a tyrant. He's a despot. I agree with you 100%. We can see in Genesis 3, God specifically stops them from eating from the tree of life after he gives them all of the punishments he will give them. We'll get to that. But God is an abuser, right? He makes these trees, puts a snake in the garden, and the snake's not Satan, it's just a snake, so you know. We'll get to that when we get to there. And then he knows exactly what will happen because he knows everything. By definition, he wanted what happened in the garden to happen. That is the only way you can interpret this with the concept of an all-knowing and all-powerful God. Nothing happens he doesn't want. Therefore, he wanted that to happen. God constantly complains about human nature. Who made human nature? He did. The God of the Bible is a monster. Whether the people writing him intended for him to be one or not doesn't really matter with how he acts. He's a terrible character. And he represents many of the worst traits we see in the sort of rulers these people had historically, and how people treated others. It wasn't very nice. We had a lot of tribalism, we had a lot of tyranny, we didn't have concept like rights. Slavery was everywhere. The idea of the human god relationship is very much like a slave master relationship in many ways, actually. Interestingly enough.
Yeah, I mean, I was just sort of gonna make a comment when you were describing how much of a monster God is. It makes me wonder, like, the people that were writing this. I don't know if they had any nefarious intentions, but it seems like an understanding of God um, in this way would be pretty beneficial for people who already are at the top of the hierarchy in society. Sort of
Yeah.
like a justification of those. Um, yeah, and I guess
Yes.
I'm just curious, like, why this like this understanding of God was so compelling for so many people over the years, or whether you think it really was, or it was just through like violence. I don't know, but yeah, I was thinking those two things. Like, what? Like, it seems very convenient for God to be written this way, and but then a simultaneous like questioning of why people would be so drawn to a God that behaves this way. I guess, yeah, like, what are your thoughts on that?
So I was trying to find the article about where the Israelites murder a bunch of Canaanite children. But yeah, I agree that the idea of this sort of God is very much useful to someone in power, right? A lot of religion and even the idea of the afterlife is really sort of a way to get people to just kind of accept what's going on. If, like, oh no, it doesn't matter what's going to happen now, follow the rules, follow the laws, act in this way, and you will go to a good place, otherwise you go to a bad place. And to be fair, that's not an Israelite concept, that's more of a Christian and I think Islamic concept as well. I think they have a hell too. But this is a very ubiquitous idea. Do the good stuff, follow society's laws, you get to live happy place and forever, and otherwise you get to go to the bad place forever. It's very much a prop to keep places running, to keep things in order, to basically put a divine gun to people's heads, right? So I agree, it's definitely incredibly useful for the ruling class, and having an angry god is also very useful for the Israelites, because here's the issue. The Israelites aren't constantly winning. They need to explain, hey, we're losing. What's going on? Why isn't God making us win? We have the best God. Their gods aren't as cool as our God. Well, they go, we pissed God off. He's going to make us lose now because we didn't do what he wanted. So this idea of a benevolent God was not the God that they probably not properly, envisioned. They had a God they had to please, and they had to please the god by generally following the cultural customs and what was put forward by the rulers. And you can see this across history. Monarchies are propped up by the god. We look at Egypt, even post Hellenistic or in the Hellenistic kingdoms, we have ruler cults. The kings are gods, or the kings were brought forth by the mandate of the gods, or so many different versions of this thing. But yeah, I would agree that this was probably this idea of God in this sort of way, where like disobey him, right? Go for something that seems good, right? Go look out for yourself. Don't just listen to what you are told. Think freely is bad. Listen to authority. Keep yourself quiet. Don't do anything that you're told not to do, even if they're wrong. God admits he's lying, we'll see in Genesis 3. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
if that maybe clarifies, or maybe
Yeah.
just clarifies my opinion at the very least.
Yeah. Pretty, I don't know. It's a
Pretty
lot to
wild.
think about. Yeah, wow.
That is some proper
Yes.
1984 shit.
Yeah.
Just look at the most religious countries in the world, and you see these trends. Look at repression and how it follows religion very much. It's a massive correlator to religion, right? Look at the worst countries to live in, and look at their religiosity. It's a very crazy trend. Whether that is religion hurting those countries, or the fact that when countries get to a point where they are now happy, where they can just live life, they just reject religion because they don't need it as a tool of hope. Because what is religion? It's a weaponization of hope. You tell people, oh, even if your life's not is going to be terrible right now, when you die, you'll be in the good place forever. Once people don't need to look forward to the good place because they're already in a good place, so much of the appeal of religion just falls away. Which is why I think that in the West we have a lot of, what's called the first world generally. Religion is drops, right? Religion is just falling and falling and falling. The U.S. is a bit behind on this compared to Europe because of McCarthyism, but it's the same thing you can see here.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's one reason, but my own like sort of personal second theory for that is I think people in those sort of societies are more compelled by like I guess paternalistic ideas of like right and wrong and sort of are more prone to like authoritarianism in a way. And I don't know if it's like I don't know why exactly, but I think growing up in like an environment of scarcity or violence sort of creates like a collective culture that's a little bit more afraid of ideas that are like potentially would upend the social order, even though it seems like that would benefit them. It's like you'll take, I guess, whatever stability you can get. I think that's I don't know. That's just my my thoughts.
Also, the idea of right and wrong and morality, and we're going along, so we'll probably cut it off after this, probably. I'll let you respond, though. I'm not just gonna, I don't need the last word. But morality um, is hard, right? What is morality? How do you get morality? I'm personally a big fan of the harm principle, subjective morality, humanism. These are all pretty cool things in my book. But what is morality for most people? It's what you're taught morality is. Of course, we have base human instincts that have evolved, but what is societally right, societally wrong, varies. Like, random example, look at incest. Society to the society, what qualifies as incest and how bad incest is radically different. The distance you have to be from someone for it to be incest and not just, a relationship goes crazy. I think there's one society where it's 8 degrees of separation. Right? That's a crazy amount. 8 degrees, that's so much. Right? I don't even know how you'd track 7 versus 8. It's that crazy without crazy genealogies. But a lot of what's right, what's wrong is just societal. And I do agree with you that authoritarian societies have much stricter codes. Well, when it comes to stricter codes, you gotta maintain the authoritarian society. The worse your society is, the more you have to keep people repressed. Otherwise, they're gonna start talking about how shit your society is, and they're gonna want to change it. Look what happened in the Soviet Union. They lifted repression, and the whole thing just fell apart very quickly. I've also heard this idea, and I linked a video that talked about it in video recommendations channel, and I don't know enough to give it to do it justice right now, but Here, I'll reply to it. It's the video about Dune and religious psychology. It was basically the idea that groups that require higher sacrifice are generally harder to disrupt. The members are more loyal to the group itself. That sort of stuff. Excuse me, sorry. Interesting idea on how culture, society, psychology often intersect. That's going to be the last thing that I'll say. So I'll turn the floor over to you. Finish off.
That's it for me. Yeah. Good
Okay.
discussion though.
Yeah, interesting topic.